King David, before his death in 1 Kings chapter 1, said, "I go the way of all men." As is pictured on the screen, this is where we all are headed. And this is what we all will leave behind. It will reference and mention those that lie under this stone, or at least the shell that lies under the stone, the time of our birth, and the time of our death. But what really matters is the dash that's in between. That dash represents the life lived. And it's that in which people will really remember. And as we are going through our Matthew study, we are studying in the life of Christ leading up to his crucifixion. And I'm sure as many are assembled today, they'll be reading the passages that discuss the observance of the Passover and the establishment of the Lord's Supper. But for our sermon today, I want us to study something that took place 2 days before. And that as we are realizing that every one of us leaves behind a memorial, we want to study Matthew chapter 26, verses 6 through 13. And in studying this together, we're wanting to ask the question of everyone here today: what memorial are you leaving behind? In this section of Scripture, we have an account unlike any other. That when we think about memorials throughout the Scriptures, throughout the Bible, they are usually in connection to remembering what God has done for His creation. The different feast days that are set up are to remind the people, here's what God did for us. After the children of Israel crossed over the Jordan River, they set up 12 stones representing each tribe and how it was that God parted the Jordan for them to be able to cross over. That was set up for a memorial, so on and so forth. But here in this section, we have Jesus establishing a memorial for what a woman did for God. And that what this one single individual decided to do, and how that we, almost 2,000 years later, are still reading about what she did. But as we're going through and we're paying attention to what she did, and that being a positive, there's a negative to this event. The memorial that is left behind is dependent upon what we're going to choose to do, and as to whether we'll be leaving behind a legacy to be remembered, or in fact those things which most people would like to try to forget. The text reads, Matthew 26, 6 through 13, "Now when Jesus was in Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, there came unto him a woman having an alabaster box of very precious ointment, and poured it on his head as he sat at meat. But when his disciples saw it, they had indignation, saying, To what purpose is this waste? For this ointment might have been sold for much and given to the poor. When Jesus understood it, he said unto them, Why trouble ye the woman? For she hath wrought a good work upon me. For you have the poor always with you, but me you have not always. For in that she hath poured this ointment on my body, she did it for my burial. Verily I say unto you, wheresoever this gospel shall be preached in the whole world, there shall also this, that this woman hath done, be told for a memorial of her." When we begin studying this section, we find a lot of important points to consider in this stage of Jesus' work and in his life, as he's moving closer and closer to his demise and to his death. One of the first things we find about this situation is that Jesus has not changed one bit from how we started our study. He is the same from the start to the end. That as he concluded his Sermon on the Mount and came down amongst the people, Matthew chapter 8, the first person we have him interacting with is a leper. Now, as we're moving towards the close of his work, and who is he still spending time with? Lepers. Still with those people that others would have nothing to do with. Just pushed to the side. And as we are seeing this constant action with the Master, and as we've been studying how the apostles struggled to comprehend the meaning of Jesus' teaching, this should have been an important point in their development and in their lesson. We have been with this man for 3 years. And everything that he does is on the same level. It's on the same tone. That there's not any inconsistency on how he behaves in helping people. And then here comes along this woman who is unnamed. And she has an understanding about what Jesus has been teaching, about what he's about to go through. And she acts upon it. And that she did this in view of his burial. In order to be able to do this, she had to have understood something. And that as we have gone through the study, as the apostles have also gone through the same study, that what Christ is leaving behind is a household meant for healing. Here is an example of what Jesus has been teaching. And the example is not coming from Jesus. It is actually somebody else doing the things that Jesus has been teaching, and he sets her up as the example. An example of that loving devotion to healing the hurt of others. And that while, throughout the majority of Jesus' life, he's been the one involved in healing hurt. And now he's the one who's needing to be comforted. That now he is the one that's needing to be tended to. In this, the most lonely time that he will go through. When we are considering the action that's going on here, nobody told her to do it. Nobody coached her. Nobody coaxed her. It was simply by her own effort. And that by her doing this simple thing, we then have this said about her. When Jesus understood it, the indignation that they had, he said unto them, Why trouble you the woman? For she hath wrought a good work upon me. Here she is doing something good, and she's doing it for the Master. And here are the apostles, and they're upset about it. Sounds just like the Pharisees. He's healing people. He's feeding people, and we cannot stand it. For ye have the poor always with you, but me ye have not always. For in that she hath poured this ointment on my body, Jesus says very clearly as to why she did it. She did it for my burial. Verily I say unto you, wheresoever this gospel shall be preached in the whole world, there shall also this, that this woman hath done, be told for a memorial of her. This is the only time that such a statement is made. Even with the Roman centurion, who had a greater faith than Jesus had seen throughout all Israel. This is not said about him. And what did she do to get this honor? Simply pouring oil over his head. But you just think about when she's doing this. Jesus, all the mighty miracles that you have performed, surely this is nowhere close to the comparison of those. But Jesus is distressed. Jesus is in turmoil. He will tell his apostles, I am grieved even unto death. And she comes along and does something like this. It is these little things in these most difficult times that end up meaning the most. The psalmist wrote in Psalm 133, I believe it is, in verses 1 through 3, behold, how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. It is like the precious ointment upon the head that ran down upon the beard, even Aaron's beard, that went down to the skirts of his garments, as the dew of Hermon and as the dew that descended upon the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord commanded the blessing, even life forevermore. When we consider what is happening here, we need to take this into consideration when we're thinking about our own life and our own trials. And that as we are reading this, that we are thinking about times where we were in turmoil and distress. And what it meant to just have somebody come along and say, it's going to be okay. And just how refreshing this would be. Here is Jesus, and he realizes my closest friends, they don't get it. They're not understanding, they're not comprehending, they're not paying attention. They're thinking selfishly in the midst of what I'm going through. And then here she comes and she says, I know. And just how helpful that would be. Memorials are built to help people remember. So what is it that Jesus wants us to remember from this? We have been presented to us that this is where the approval of God is placed. That here is a demonstration. Here is an illustration of everything that Jesus has been teaching. that with everything that you have going on in your life, you stop and you pay attention to somebody else. And here is a woman that let that teaching of Christ mold her and to change her, to produce the attitude of devotion, loving, caring, understanding, and insight to move her to do this. Just imagine if she had sat by, knowing what she knew, and that this is what Jesus was going through, is just, well, I would really like to do this. And then she did it. She wouldn't have this memorial. But set that to the side, and she would not have helped the Savior. Here we have, with this unnamed woman, the summation, the totality of the Sermon on the Mount. With what she did, is this not Jesus' way of saying that as you see in this memorial, I want you to be like this? Absolutely, that's what's happening. And that when we view this action being done on her part, the approval that's placed on it, but then we start pinpointing, we start thinking about how it was done. As we mentioned, it was spontaneous. There came unto him a woman having an alabaster box of very precious ointment. Not only is it spontaneous, but it's opulent. It's valuable. It's of great profit. Mark 14:5 of this same account, we're told that the amount of what it could have been sold for it might have been sold for more than 300 pence. Not just 300 pence, more than 300 pence. Which would have equaled out to a year's wages during this time frame. We need to remember this. That as she is involved in this process, and she has this very precious ointment, she does not say to herself, well, no, I'm not using that, I'm saving that for a special occasion. And something like that would have been used probably for a great feast and in welcoming the guests. But she took something like that and used it for this. That's saying something. These are the positive elements of this memorial. And the good things that are said of a person that will do these kinds of things and the kind of influence that they're leaving behind. But in this account, there's a negative that goes along with this positive. There's a memorial that we want to leave behind, but then there's also a picture of a memorial we do not want to leave behind. But when his disciples saw it, they had indignation, saying, to what purpose is this waste? For this ointment might have been sold for much and given to the poor. Mark's account gives us similar information. And there were some that had indignation within themselves and said, why was this waste of the ointment made? For it might have been sold for more than 300 pence and have been given to the poor. And they murmured against her. Now we want to read from John. What we're going to read from John is not the same event. This is happening in the house of Simon a leper 2 days before the Passover. What we're going to read in John is something different. It took place 6 days. And it took place in the house of Lazarus. And we're dealing with Mary. But it's interesting how that the same thing ends up happening. In John chapter 12, in verse 4, John gives us a name of how this murmuring and how this indignation actually came to be. Then saith one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, which should betray him. Why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence and given to the poor? This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the bag, and bare what was put therein. 6 days before the Passover, 4 days before what we're reading in Matthew chapter 26. This happens with Lazarus in Bethany. So just consider the attitude of Judas. Here we have this unnamed woman contrasted to one of the 12. And just look at the difference. The care and concern from somebody outside of the group, and that she is thinking about and watching over the master. And here's one of the 12, and he says, why is this being wasted? Here we find with Judas what's happening. Here we find Judas being critical about the action, the thing being done. Here is Judas, and he's criticizing not just something good that's being done, he's criticizing something good being done to Jesus. One of the 12. The inner group. And he's got this bad attitude. What we are taught is that loving kindness is often misunderstood. And the reason why is because it is so backward to how the world views things. The idea to suffer and not strike back and not lash out. Turn the other cheek. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, suffer the wrong. And we're also being shown that all the teaching that Jesus had presented up to this point had no power or sway over Judas. Now, brethren, that's a scary thought. That even as we are sitting here today, and having gone through all the teaching and study together, and that teaching can still have no influence. That here's Judas and he's still behaving the same old way. But now that we have the source, we need to go back to Matthew chapter 26. And we need to notice something. John tells us 4 days before, Judas is the one saying this. Now here we are 4 days later, 2 days before the Passover. Now look who's saying it. But when his disciples saw it, they had indignation. Mark 14:4, and there were some that had indignation within themselves and said, why was this waste of the ointment made? Now we have it in the plural. Now it's not just Judas. This seems to have spread. Where did they get this? That word indignation is the Greek agonaktheo. And it means to grieve, to be greatly afflicted, to be much or sore displeased. This is not just some little irritation that's happening. This is something that's going deep into them. Now, where did it come from? Look at what they're saying. For this ointment might have been sold for much and given to the poor. Oh, that's a good idea. But where would they have gotten this idea? Very well could be that what was first planted by Judas is now coming back up again. Be careful who you're listening to. Because Judas said this too. Oh, it could have been sold and given to the poor. Oh, that's so good, Judas. No. His intentions were not pure. He really did not care about the thief. Oh, but he said it, so what? People can say and give a presentation of just about anything. It does not mean that they're sincere. And it definitely means you need to watch them. The memorial that's being set up by Judas. Be careful who you're listening to, but also be careful as to who you're influencing. What attitude do you have today that you're spreading to others? And the damage that it's doing. The hurt that it's actually causing to somebody else. Well, who is this hurting? It's hurting Jesus. That when he should be able to be with his friends, to be comforted, to be refreshed by them, what's he having to do? Now I have to address this. And thus that's the problem with selfishness. You're not thinking about what's going on around you. Just thinking about what you have going on, what your desires are. And in the spreading of the attitude, just like with Judas, he didn't care about the poor. It tells us he was a thief. So what is he doing? Well, let me get this to spread to get the majority on my side, and then we'll be able to get this done. That kind of stuff goes on in the church too. We're being shown how to be and how not to be. That just like with Judas, criticizing a good work to get what you want. To get what you want and to cover up how you really are. When we remember what Jesus has already taught about covetousness, materialism. We're in Matthew 26, but you go all the way back to Matthew chapter 6, and Jesus said, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." And then Jesus concludes with verse 24 by saying, "No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else will he hold to the one and despise the other. Ye cannot serve God and mammon," money, wealth. Judas said it should not be done because he was a thief. Judas is a prime example of Matthew 6, 19 through 24. You want to know what this looks like? Judas is that memorial. So here is Judas's memorial. A memorial of a life that let material things take hold of his heart. To the point of even trying to use the treasury of Jesus that was designed to help the priests, but also it's designed to help the poor. Judas never gave up his materialism. But even as we consider this life, some might try to say, but he followed Jesus and that was good. Doesn't change who he is. There are plenty of people today in the church following Jesus, but they're not who they're needing to be. They're not who they really are. Well, he's trying. No, he's not. The only thing he's trying is to cover up who he really is. That he's not been converted. He's not been regenerated. He's not been made a new creature. And he followed that selfish desire until he was willing to betray the Lord. And that is a memorial for us. That one can hear everything that Christ said and still allow the world to dominate them. But we also see in this that Jesus corrected his disciples. That even at this point in their development, Matthew 26, and in just 2 days, he's going to be betrayed by Judas, arrested, and he's going to be crucified. And yet Jesus does not give up on those that he knows are trying. Okay, it's clear you're not getting this. It's clear you're still not understanding. And at this point, Jesus could have said, okay, we are 2 days away from all of this being accomplished. I'm setting you guys to the side and I'm starting with new. But he didn't do that. Because going back to the talents, he knows our abilities. He knows what's there. To where Jesus responds. Jesus understood it. He said unto them, Why trouble ye the woman? For she hath wrought a good work upon me. For you have the poor always with you, but me you have not always. For in that she hath poured this ointment on my body, she did it for my burial. In this situation, Jesus calls them out and he points it out and he says, You fellas are all wrong. And that she understands more than you. Leave her alone. And that in doing this for the Son of God, she sent perfume upward. In a time where everything could be soured, having lost all of its savor because of what's coming ahead. But that this loving sacrifice being made for him brought sweetness back in. That as she is involved in doing this, it's a reminder, it's a memorial to the Son of God. She is coming before him and saying to him, You are doing this for me. So as we think about what memorial are you leaving behind? We understand that as it comes time to memorialize people, I'm sure we've all been to several funerals where the person that died was just the worst person that ever lived. But that when it comes to remember them, all of a sudden, they become a saint. God does not deal with us that way. The memorial and the remembering that God has of us is that of which we actually are. So I need to question with my life, am I behaving as this woman did? That as I am going through this life, am I adding beauty to life? Am I involved in bringing pleasure in times of darkness? Comfort to those that are in sorrow? Is my life motivated by love and devotion and following the teachings of Christ? And that I'm able to bring light and fragrance into people's life. Or am I a Judas? The memorial that we have of Judas is this. Here lies Judas, Mark 14:21. Good were it for that man if he had never been born. Oh, but he followed Jesus for those 3 years. Doesn't matter. This is the outcome. Will I be all the things that we listed here, or will I end up being a person that people sigh when they see me coming? Am I a person that makes other people's lives more difficult instead of easier? Am I really dedicated to this? Am I really converted? Or am I like Judas? And that I'm just using this to get my way. Criticizing of good works so as to do it. Deceiving and misleading others. By my supposed good intentions. Judas is in the church today. His attitude lives on. Well, I do not want to be like that. That's good. So start being like the woman that we studied. That as we go through this life and that we are constantly on the lookout. Who can I help today? In what way can I sacrifice for the benefit of somebody else? And that what it is that I'm wanting to do is of a pure motive. We cannot overlook that factor of Judas. That seems like a good thing, but it was rotten to the core. And that if we're not careful, that'll be us. But while it is today, we have the chance to set a new track and a new path to leave a better remembrance, a better influence. That as it said of Abel, though he's dead, he yet speaks. That as people look back on our lives and they remember how we lived, they'll see the purity of Christ in us. So as we bring this to a close, if anyone is in need of prayers of encouragement, of assistance, we offer this time as we stand and as